Forgotten in the wilderness as a test of faith, a Lakota chief found her and asked nothing back. The fire had burned down to coals by the time I found her boot. Just the one boot. Half buried in the mud at the creek's edge, the leather split along the seam where too many miles had worked it loose. I stood with it in my hand a moment, turned it over. The sole was worn smooth at the heel, more worn on the outside than the inside. A woman's walk angled out, not the heavy flat plan of a man. I set it down and looked across the water. I was 3 days out from the village, checking the elk trails before the first deep cold came down off the ridgeline. It was late in the moon when the rivers freeze at the edges, what the settlers called October's end, and the aspens had already dropped most of their color, leaving the hillsides brown and bare and stripped down to their bones. A hard time of year, not the time you find a woman's boot at a creek with no woman attached to it. I crossed. The bank on the other side was chewed up. Boot prints, 2 sets, and then moccasin prints. Mine weren't among them, so another band passing through, and the marks of a wagon that had been here and left again. Wheel ruts heading east, deep enough that the load had been heavy going out, but the ruts pressed lighter here on the way in, so they'd lighten the wagon before they turned around. I stood there a while and let the picture settle. They'd left something behind when they turned back, something that didn't weigh much. I followed the boot prints away from the creek and up into the tree line. The pines there grew thick enough to hold the cold in around their roots, and the ground was damp and soft. The prints wandered, stopped, wandered again. She had been lost already when she left the water, not walking toward anything, just walking away from where the wagon had gone. I have tracked a great many things in my life, and I know what purpose looks like in a track, the way a decided man puts his foot down different from a frightened one. These tracks had no purpose in them, only movement, and movement is not the same thing. I found her in a hollow between 2 fallen pines, curled into herself with her arms drawn tight and her knees up. Her dress was wool, heavy, dark, soaked through at the hem and the sleeve. Her hair was loose and tangled with needles. She was breathing, I could see the lift of her side, but she had gone inside herself somewhere, past shivering, which told me how long the cold had had her. I crouched down and put my hand flat against her cheek. Her eyes opened. Blue, very blue, the color of high sky in the mornings, and for a moment they held nothing. Then fear came into them, and fear is honest, and I respected it. I said to her in English, "I had enough, you are cold. I am going to make a fire." She did not answer, she watched me move. I built the fire close to the hollow, between the 2 fallen pines where the wood was dry, and I worked fast because her color was wrong. That gray-white that comes before a person stops. I had dried meat in my pack in a water skin, and I had my robe, which was elk hide and thick, and had kept me warm on worse nights than this. When the fire had caught, I laid the robe over her, and I brought her water, and she drank it slowly, carefully, the way a person drinks who has forgotten how. I watched the color come back into her hands. She was perhaps 30 years. Not young like a girl, and not old like a woman who has worn herself out. Somewhere between, with a face that had some sun on it and some weather, and around her eyes the kind of marks that come from squinting a long time against bright things. A woman who had lived outside, who had done work. When she had some warmth back, she said, in a voice that came out rough and small, "What are you going to do with me?" I said, "I am going to take you somewhere warm." She said, "Where?" I said, "My village." She closed her eyes. I did not know if that was agreement or surrender or simply that she had no more argument in her. After a while she said, "The men who were with me, they left." I said, "Yes." She said, "I knew they were going to. I knew it 2 days before." I said nothing to that. There was nothing useful to say to it. She said, "Why didn't you just ride past?" I thought about that. It was a fair question and it deserved a fair answer. I said, "Because I am not the kind of man who rides past." She looked at me then, not the way she'd looked at me before with fear in it, but with something else, something slower. Then she looked at the fire. I let her rest. I made my camp there that night in the hollow between the fallen pines, and I kept the fire through the dark, and I watched the hills, and I let her sleep. She slept hard and deep, the way a person sleeps when the body has given up trying to stay vigilant and simply shut itself down to recover. I did not sleep much. There was no reason to. My name is Lakota. This is what it means. Friend to everyone, though that is a loose translation, the kind that loses the edge of the thing. More accurately, it means the one who considers himself bound to care for those around him, which is different from being generous, which can be a choice made when it is easy. The word I carry means something that has no exit in it. I was born in the time of my grandfather's grandfather's grandfather. No, that is wrong, I do not know exactly. What I know is that by the time this woman was sleeping in the hollow, I had been alive long enough to have buried a wife, 2 children, a brother, 4 men I called friends the way you only call a man friend after you have bled beside him. I had been chief of my band for 18 years. 18 years of deciding, of holding, of being the place where the weight got set down. I was not a lonely man. I want to be clear about that. I had people around me the way a stone in a river has water around it, but there is a kind of aloneness that is not about the number of people nearby. It is about whether any of them look at you and see a man rather than what the man represents. My people looked at me and saw their chief, which is right, which is how it should be. I am not complaining about it. I am only saying that for a very long time, no one had looked at me and simply seen Lakota. We rode back toward the village the next morning. I put her on my horse and I walked, because the horse was strong enough for 1 but not comfortable for 2, and I am not a small man. She sat forward in the saddle and held the horn, and she did not complain about anything. I appreciated that. I have known men who complained more in easier conditions. Around midday I heard her say from up on the horse, "You haven't asked me anything." I said, "You'll tell me what you want to tell me." She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "My name is Clara Marsh. I was traveling with my husband's brother and his family. We were going to Oregon." I said, "Were?" She said, "My husband died in Missouri 3 weeks before we left. His brother said he would still take me, that there was a place for me if I worked." I said, "What happened?" She said, "He found a reason to leave me behind. He'd been looking for one for a while." I said, "Because you were the dead man's wife and not his own." She said, "Yes." I said nothing. We walked on. The hills were bare and the sky was the particular kind of pale blue that carries cold in it, and the ground was hard underfoot. I could hear an elk somewhere to the south, a bull by the sound of it, and I noted that for later. She said, "You can drop me at the next settlement. I don't need to trouble you further." I said, "The next settlement is 4 days east. You have no coat. You have 1 boot. You have no food." She said, "I'll manage." I said, "Yes, I believe you would try, but there is no reason to try when there is an easier way." She didn't answer that. After a while she said, "Your English is very good." I said I had a friend once, a trapper. He wintered with us 3 years, talked a great deal. She made a sound that was almost a laugh, not quite but the shape of one. I said, "He is dead now." She said, "I'm sorry." I said, "He died in a fight. He picked himself. He was like that." This time she did laugh, just a small thing, brief but real. We came to the village in the late afternoon of the 2nd day. The outriders had spotted us and word had gone in ahead, so when we rode in, she on the horse, me walking at the bridle, there were people watching. Not in an unfriendly way. In the way of people who are curious and not bothering to pretend otherwise. My sister came out to meet us. Her name was Winona, which means firstborn daughter, though she was not the firstborn, she was the 3rd, but she had the nature of a firstborn, and so the name had attached itself to her early and stayed. She was a hard woman in the way that good wood is hard, not brittle, just dense, not easily worked but worth the effort. She looked at Clara on the horse, and she looked at me, and she said in Lakota, "Well, you found a stray." I said, "Help her down, she's cold still." Winona said she will need clothes and food, and someone to explain to her that she is not here to be used and not here to be watched over like a child. I said, tell her that yourself. Her English is the same as yours. Winona looked at me a moment with an expression I knew, the one that meant she was filing something away for later examination. Then she turned to Clara and said in English, come down from there. You look half dead and there is soup. Clara came down and she stood in the middle of the village and looked around at the lodges and the dogs and the children who had gathered at a practical distance to stare, and I watched her take it in. She did not look afraid. She looked like someone trying to calculate something. She said to Winona, thank you. Winona said, don't thank me yet, come. She stayed. That is the short version. The longer version is that she stayed because she had nowhere else to go, and then she stayed because she had started to be useful, and then she stayed because she had started to belong, and those are 3 different reasons, and they came in that order over the course of about 3 months. By the time the snow was heavy and the days were short, she was making herself understood in broken Lakota that was improving fast, and she had learned to work the hides, and she was teaching the children numbers and letters in English, and nobody thought of her as the stray anymore. I did not seek her out during those months. I want to be clear about that. I'm a man who has always understood the difference between what I want and what is appropriate, and those 2 things are not always the same thing. She was a woman who had been left behind by a dead man's kin, and she was finding her footing, and the last thing she needed was the chief of the band deciding she owed him something for being brought in from the cold. I have seen men do that. Decide a kindness creates a debt. It is a particular kind of smallness, and I have never had patience for it. So I left her to find her own ground. What I noticed, because I notice things, because 40 years of living on the land teaches you to see without seeming to look, what I noticed was that she watched me. Not the way a woman watches a man she is afraid of. The other way. The way a person watches something they are trying to understand. In the evenings, when the band gathered and I sat with the older men and we talked about what needed talking about, the elk movements, the condition of the winter stores, a dispute between 2 families over a horse, I would feel her attention on me from across the fire. I did not acknowledge it. It was not the time. Winter came on hard that year. The 3rd week of the deep cold, 2 of my best hunters came back with nothing and told me the elk had shifted north and east, further than usual, and the winter stores, though we had laid them in carefully, were not built for a gap in the hunting that long. I spent 3 days working through the problem before I had the shape of a plan, and then I called the men together and laid it out. We would split into 2 parties. One would take the women and children to the lower valley where my brother's band wintered, where there was shelter and stored meat enough to take more mouths. The other group, 12 men, would push north to find the elk and drive them south if possible and hunt until we had enough. It was not a complicated plan. It was simply hard. The night before we split up, Clara came to the entrance of my lodge. She stood outside and said my name, and I told her to come in. She stood just inside the entrance and looked at me in the firelight. She said, Winona told me what you're doing, splitting up. I said yes. She said, you're taking the hunting party. I said yes. She said, because it's the harder thing. I said, because I am faster on the trail than the older men, and I have the most experience with the country to the north. She said, that's true, and it's also the harder thing, and you know it. I looked at her. She was holding something, a piece of folded leather, and she held it out to me. She said, Winona showed me how. I've been working on it for 3 weeks. I took it. It was a pair of moccasins, heavily beaded, the stitching very careful in the way of a person who has recently learned a skill and is being exacting about it because they know they do not yet have the instinct. The beadwork was geometric, a pattern I recognized. It was similar to one my wife had used, not the same, but the same feeling. I turned them over in my hands. She said, Winona said your others were worn thin. She said you never ask for anything, that you just do without. I sat with that for a moment. She said it's a small thing. I said it is not a small thing. She looked at the ground between us and then back at me. She said, you came back for me from the cold. You walked beside the horse for 2 days. You brought me in and you haven't asked me for a single thing. Not once. Not a word, not a look, nothing. And I. She stopped, started again. She said I've had men be kind to me and it always costs something. Always. And I kept waiting for the cost with you. I kept watching, waiting for it. And there wasn't one. I said no, there is no cost. She said why? I thought about how to answer that. I said, because a man who does right only when he is rewarded for it is not doing right. He is trading. She stood there with the firelight on her face and her eyes very bright. She said, quiet, I think you might be the best man I have ever known, and I have been looking for a long time. I said nothing for a moment. There is a kind of thing a person can say that lands so straight and true that the only wrong response is to deflect it or to rush to fill the silence. I let it sit. I let it be what it was. Then I said, that is something I will carry with me north. We were gone 19 days. I will not tell all of it. There were nights that were cold in a way that goes past cold into something else, something that gets into the thinking and makes simple decisions feel heavy. There was a storm on the 4th day that pushed us into a ravine for 36 hours. There was a man in my party, a young man named Chaska, who had taken a cut across the palm before we left and had not told anyone, and 3 days in the hand had swelled and he was feverish, and I had to make the decision about whether to send him back alone or keep him with us or carry him. I kept him with us. I dressed the wound myself each morning and each night with the herbs I carry, and I put him in the center of the line where the walking was easiest, and I kept an eye on him without making it obvious I was keeping an eye on him, because a young man's dignity matters and there was no reason to damage it. On the 8th day we found the elk. It took 3 more days of driving and hunting and driving again, working in the cold with our hands going numb in the afternoons, moving meat, caching it, marking the caches. By the time we turned south we had enough. Not comfortable enough, but enough. The difference matters. On the 14th day, coming back through the high pass, I slipped on ice and went down hard on my left side and something in my rib cracked. I knew the feeling. I had broken ribs before. I got up and kept moving because there was nothing else to do. I told no one. There was no reason to. We came back to the winter camp in the lower valley on the 19th day, at midday, in flat white light off the snow. I could see smoke from the fires and people coming out to meet us as we came in. I was breathing careful because of the rib, taking the air in small amounts that did not reach the place where it caught. I saw Clara at the edge of the group. She saw me and she walked toward me, not running, walking, the way a person walks when they have decided something and the decision is made and there is no hurry anymore. She came up and she stopped in front of me and she looked at my face, and then she looked down at the way I was standing and she said, "You're hurt." I said, "It's a rib." She said, "More than one, the way you're holding yourself." I said, "1, maybe 1.5. She said, "There is no 1.5 of a rib. Come inside." She put her hand on my arm, the left arm, the side that hurt, and she held it there and walked with me into the lodge that Winona had given her. She took my coat and she looked at the side with her hands and she pressed careful, and I did not make a sound, but she saw my face when she found the spot and she said, "2." I said, "Possibly." She wrapped them herself. She had learned it, apparently. She had spent the 19 days learning things. Winona had been teaching her, and she had been an apt student, and somewhere in those 19 days she had covered a lot of ground. She worked with her hands and her mouth was a tight line of concentration, and she was very close to me and I could smell wood smoke in her hair. When she was done, she sat back and looked at me. She said, "I prayed for you. Every day. I'm not sure who I was praying to. I'm not sure it matters. I said, maybe it doesn't. She said, Winona told me something. She told me that you have not taken a woman into your lodge since your wife died, that it has been 6 years. I said, that is true. She said she told me that, and then she gave me this lodge. I said, Winona is not subtle. Clara said, no, she is not. We sat there in the firelight, the two of us, with the cold outside and the sound of the camp settling back into itself after the return, children and dogs and voices, all of it muffled by the lodge walls. She was looking at me with those blue eyes that still sometimes caught me off guard, that high sky blue, and there was no calculation in them now. Whatever she had been trying to figure out about me in those months before, she had figured it out. She said, I know you won't ask. I know that's not who you are, so I'm telling you, I am not going anywhere. I said, you have a life to get back to. There will be people looking for you come spring. She said, what people? My husband is dead. His brother left me in the snow. My family is in Pennsylvania and they think I am in Oregon. I have been more at home here in 4 months than I have been anywhere in 10 years. I said, this is not an easy life. She said, I know that. I have been living it. I said, my people will not all welcome you. She said, some of them already do. The ones who matter have been decent to me, and the ones who haven't, I've dealt with worse. I said, I am old. She said, you are not old. I said, I am old enough that some men in my position would call themselves old. She said, those men can speak for themselves. I am speaking about you. You are strong and you are good and you have more life in you than men half your age, and I am not interested in what other men in your position would call themselves. I sat with that. I said, why me? That is what I want to know. There are younger men. She said, because you walked beside the horse for 2 days, because you built the fire first and then asked questions, because you did not make me feel that your kindness was a purchase, because Chaska told me about his hand and how you dressed it every morning without making him ashamed, because your people look at you and I can see in their faces what they think of you, and it is not fear and it is not flattery, it is something real, something earned. She paused. Then she said, because when I tell you something that is true about you, you do not argue with it or dismiss it. You let it be true. I looked at her for a long time. I said, I have not been looked at like that in a long time. She said, I know. Winona told me that too. She said you carry everything and you never show it, and it makes her angry because you deserve to put some of it down. I said, Winona talks too much. Clara said, Winona loves you, in the way that a good woman loves a man who will not say when he is hurting. I said she has her own concerns. Clara said she does, and this is one of them. The fire had settled by then to a steady thing, not bright, just warm and consistent. Outside the wind had come up and you could hear it pressing against the lodge walls, a sound I have known my whole life, the particular tone of the winter wind when the cold is set in for real and the land has accepted it. She moved and she sat next to me and she put her shoulder against mine, gentle, mindful of the wrapped ribs, and she stayed there. She did not say anything more. There was nothing more that needed saying. She had said what she came to say, and now she was just there, solid and warm and by her own choice, no cost, nothing owed. I put my arm around her. Outside, the wind, the fire, the sound of the camp going on around us, all those lives, all that living, my responsibility and my people and my long work of being the thing that holds, all of it still there, still mine, always mine. But just then, for the first time in a long time, I was not the chief of anyone. I was just Lakota, with a woman's shoulder under my arm and the fire doing what fires do, and the cold shut out. Spring came late and cold that year, the snow holding on past when it usually broke. When it finally let go, the mud season was long and the trails were poor, and it was June before the high passes were clear enough to travel. A rider came through from the east in late May. He stopped at the village and asked for water, a white man, a trader heading west, and he was the kind of man who talked because silence made him uncomfortable. He sat by the fire and he told whatever he knew, which was a great deal about what had happened in the lower settlements over the winter and a little about the wider world. Clara was there. She listened to him, and she did not speak much, but she listened, and he went on his way by the afternoon. That evening she came and sat with me on the rise above the village where I sometimes went to think, a place where you could see the hills going out in 3 directions and the river catching the last light below. She sat down next to me, and we looked at the country for a while. She said he knew someone who knew the family I was traveling with. Apparently they made it to Oregon. They said they lost a woman on the trail, said she went off and couldn't be found. I said nothing. She said they believed it, or they said they believed it. Same thing, I suppose. I said, "Are you troubled by it?" She said I was, a little. Last winter some nights I would think about what they were telling people, what my name was turning into in someone else's story. I would think about that. I said, "And now?" She looked out at the hills. She said, "Now I think a name is what you make it where you are. And I know what I am here. I know what my days are. I know what I have." She turned and she looked at me with the evening light on her face, that blue very steady and clear. She said, "What I have is enough." I said, "Yes." She said, "More than enough." I said, "Yes." She reached over and put her hand on mine, her fingers fitting between mine, just resting there, warm. We sat there on that rise until the light was gone and the stars came up one by one in their order, the way they always do, the way they always will, not caring about any particular man's story, not watching over any particular woman's choice, just doing what they do in the cold and the dark and the vast indifference of the sky. But she had made her choice. She had made it in the hollow between 2 fallen pines in the cold, when she looked at me without fear and let me build the fire. She had made it across the winter, piece by piece, day by day, until by the time I came back from the north there was nothing left to decide. And what I had done, all I had done, was be who I am. I have thought about that a great deal since. There is a kind of man who believes he must perform his worth, who must announce himself, position himself, make his case. I have known those men. Some of them were brave in their own way. Some of them were even good. But there is another kind of man, rarer, who simply lives according to what he is, and the right people see it in time, and the ones who don't never would have anyway. I do not say I am one of those men. That is not for me to say. But I will say that she saw something, and she was not a woman who was easily fooled. She was a woman who had been left in the snow by people who were supposed to care for her, and she had come through it, and she had spent 4 months watching everything around her with the careful attention of a person who has learned not to take things at face value. She saw something. And on the nights when the wind comes up hard and the cold gets in around the edges of things, and the weight of all the years I have carried settles down on me, there are still those nights. There will always be those nights. On those nights I reach across in the dark and she is there. I am not saved by that. I am not repaired by it. I do not need to be. But I am not alone in it. And she is not there because she has to be, not for cost, not for obligation, not because I asked. She is there because she looked at who I am and she stayed. That is enough. That is more than enough. It is everything. I am telling you this in the autumn of a later year. My hair is white now and the cold gets into my hip where it never used to, and Chaska leads the hunts because his eyes are sharper than mine for distance, though I will not admit the distance part directly. The village is larger than it was. The times are harder in ways I will not go into here, harder than most people outside them understand, and there are decisions I carry that are not easy and never will be. But last week I was out early in the gray morning before anyone was up, crouching by the creek to check the set of a snare, and I heard her footsteps behind me. I know her walk the way I know the creak of my own lodge, and she came and crouched beside me without a word, just to see what I was looking at, and her shoulder was against mine in the cold, and her breath made a small cloud in the air. We stayed like that a while. The snare was empty, the creek was running low, a hawk went over. Then we went in together, out of the cold into the fire. That is my story, that is all of it.